Thank you all for being here. As mentioned, my name's Rory, and I am our Director of Conservation at Fresno Chaffee Zoo, and I'm here today to tell you about some work we've been doing for the last 5 years with these lovely guys, blunt-nosed leopard lizards. There's at least anecdotal observations of ground squirrels going after them also and chomping on them, so they may be yet another victim of the rabid killer ground squirrels. But today we're going to talk about some of their other threats and some of the things we're doing to try to bring them back throughout their range. To kick off, I just wanted to sort of point out this whole ecosystem that exists in California that not everyone's aware of. It's the San Joaquin Desert. It's a whole ecosystem that only occurs in Central California and has been about 95% depleted in the last 200 years. So that great Central Valley, at least the area south of the Delta, a couple hundred years ago was about half wetland and about half upland desert, and it's since been converted into basically uniform irrigated agriculture. And this is the upland desert part of that community, which still exists on the southern extent of the Diablo Range, which is where most of this story is going to take place. And it's home to a whole suite of unique organisms. The ones on the top are basically only found there, and then the ones at the bottom exist in some other areas, but still are fairly unique to the Southwest deserts. We have things like the San Joaquin kit fox, giant kangaroo rats, 3 other species of rare and endangered kangaroo rat, and then our lovely blunt-nosed leopard lizards, which are going to be the star of the rest of the show. So in case blunt-nosed leopard lizards are a new thing, I know even growing up as a herpetologist, I guess I wasn't a herpetologist as a kid. I was a budding, wanting to be a herpetologist as a kid. I basically never heard of these things because I didn't grow up in California. And I find even people that have grown up in their heart of their range have often never heard about them. So in case these are new to you, I wanted to go through a little bit of their background. They were actually on the inaugural endangered species list in the late 1960s. They're also one of California's fully protected species. They were listed out even before California or the federal government had an endangered species list. So we've known they've been in trouble for a long time. They're pretty short-lived in the wild, only 1 to 3 years, though we think in human care they could live easily 10 years. We have some that are about 7 years old at the zoo right now. They're pretty chunky lizards, at least for a North American lizard. They weigh 25 to 65 grams, which maybe doesn't sound like too much, but they're a big lizard. You notice them if you go out and see them. They're about 4 times the size of the bluebellies that are super common around here. They primarily eat arthropods, so lots of bug eaters, although they have some relatives that really like to eat other lizards. They're egg layers. They produce 1 to 3 clutches a year, almost always 4 eggs, 2 from each ovary. We see it over and over again because we ultrasound them out in the field. And they are very closely associated with rodent burrows. They really like to hang out around both ground squirrel burrows, but also kangaroo rat burrows, which in their ecosystem just sort of turns the ground into Swiss cheese, if you've ever been out in some of those San Joaquin Desert areas. So that's a little bit about who they are. And then another sort of key thing I wanted to walk you guys through before we get into the rest of the science is a little bit about sort of what their average year is and what their life is like, because they spend more than half the year underground. At least that's what has historically been thought. They are laid as eggs in midsummer, like July-ish. They stay in the ground for a couple months usually, usually it's about 60 days that it takes them to incubate. They then hatch out. Over here, you get your little hatchlings that are going to be above ground for a month or 2. They come out in late July, and they start to disappear by the end of September. You then generally don't see any lizards until the next spring. In the spring, say March to April, they come out. You see the yearlings, and the yearlings are already sexually mature. They're right on the edge of being sexually mature. They stay active through about the end of July, and then they become dormant again. They don't really overlap with the babies very much at all. If you go out in August, you'll see babies and you won't see adults for the most part. And then if they're really lucky, they go dormant, they survive again, they go down in like late July, and they'll survive to come back up again in April and do the whole thing again. The oldest one ever observed was 5. It was 1 at a site that had been monitored for decades. The vast majority don't make it past 2 years old. with over half of them only living that first year in the wild. So they're almost annuals in nature, at least in the relic habitat in that last 5% that we're able to study them in. And as a result of all this and all the habitat loss, they have been blinking out at an alarming rate, despite being on the endangered species list. So this plot over here shows the sort of two main genetic groups. Depending on your philosophy, you would call them two separate species. This northern group and this southern group last shared an ancestor about 2.5 million years ago, kind of on the order of us and chimpanzees, just to give you a sense of the timing. And the reason there was that big break, I think, was the historic Tulare Lake Basin, which would have separated these northern groups and the southern groups. The northern group in particular has really been declining rapidly. They've lost like 30% or more of known populations just this century. And the ones we work with are in the Panoche Hills region, which is on the eastern edge of the Diablo Range. And in 2019 and 2020, we watched the last population on protected land in this northern clade basically disappear. We thought it had completely blinked out. We saw a dozen animals out there at the start of the season. By the end of the season, it was down to 6. We confirmed this with fecal genotyping as well as our behavioral observations. We got emergency permission to collect 5 of them that year to the following year to bring in and try to get them to breed in captivity so we could start trying to rewild this area, learn how to rewild them, and possibly then apply that to the many other areas that they've recently blinked out. And we've been successful so far. This is our first little baby. I like to call him Smiley. And since then, we have actually produced 234 hatchlings. Thank you. And these are multiple generations of hatchlings, so we've had success getting them to breed in captivity, fully rearing them in captivity and breeding them. And we have begun doing all sorts of things about them. I'm getting ahead of myself. We are trying to not just make animals to release to the wild, but we want to produce wild type animals to release to the wild. And it's very easy for an animal to become almost instantly domesticated. It only takes a couple generations if you're not really careful that you end up propagating traits totally by accident that are beneficial for an organism in a little box in human care, but not beneficial to them in the wild. So we're measuring kind of everything we can measure non-destructively about these animals, measuring wild ones and then trying to compare to make sure that we're producing animals like the wild ones, and then also so we can see which ones do well, and we can possibly target our rearing protocols to produce animals with the traits that are most successful in the wild. And just to give you a sense of that, I'm going to focus on this growth and maturation piece. But if anyone's interested about any of the other things, I could talk your ear off all day. So these are growth trajectories of males on the left, females on the right. Age is the x-axis. The y-axis for this is snout vent length, which is a sort of standard measure of the body length of a lizard. Size of maturity is shown with that dashed line going across. The gray shaded areas are when they would typically be dormant. The white areas are when they would typically be active. And then the dark line are measurements from wild animals. The orange line are measurements from our captive colony. And all the little skinny lines are the individual lizards that we've measured over time. And the main take-home thing is they look really similar. So our animals in human care are growing up, they're becoming mature at the exact same rate as the wild ones. So we think we're being able to recreate those natural wild type conditions in human care quite well, and we're getting a very similar phenotype from our babies. So then we don't want them just to live at the zoo. At about 10 months old each spring, we release them. And we actually got to have a bunch of folks from Save Mount Diablo join us last year for our release. We've released 72 so far back to Panoche Plateau. We are anticipating releasing over 50 next spring. Fingers crossed. We have 69 young ones that just went down for their winter sleep. And we put transmitters on each one of them. This is one of our collar type transmitters, so we can track them all throughout their lives to see how they're doing. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, but is worth pointing out, is that all this plant you see, or almost all of it, is an invasive grass called red brome. Almost all of it's red brome. The only things that aren't are these little bushes here. Those are native ephedra shrubs. And these animals did not evolve in a landscape dominated by grasses. The grasses also came within about the last couple hundred years. They evolved in a landscape that had small forbs, had bushes, a few bunch grasses, and then these nice little channels between everything that the lizards used as their highways and runways. It wasn't just the lizards. The kangaroo rats did this too. The snakes did it. The antelope ground squirrels. The whole ecosystem evolved together without these carpeting grasses. And we've started to find that, especially for our blunt nose, and we think for a lot of species, these grasses cause a problem. You put a blunt nose in grass, it just sits there and doesn't move. We tried it. We documented it. It will stay there for months, basically, and not go anywhere. Where when you put them in an open area where they can see where they're going and they're not bumping into stuff, they run around, they live like a natural wild lizard. So this first year, this is from 2023, you may remember we had a record wet year after many years of drought. The grasses just went insane out there. It became a full carpeted mess. So we tried in year one to, I didn't show it. Yeah. This area, you can barely tell, but we mowed this by hand. We mowed about 20 acres out there with weed whackers trying to take care of it before we released our lizards. But it didn't really help. We left enough thatch behind, we just weren't able to rake it all out. The lizards still didn't do very well. So now we've started doing some moderately large scale grazing trials out there. In this part of the San Joaquin Desert, the southern end of the Diablo Range, sheep farming, or sheep ranching, was sort of, it's like the historic economy of the place, at least historic for the Europeans that wound up there. And they're having some hard times, so we're sort of seeing it as this win-win where we can bolster historically relevant economic practice, the sheep raising, and use it to do some habitat management. So we're trying to figure out what is the grazing practice that will best reduce this cover in a way that is beneficial for the native plants and beneficial for the native animals, but knocks back the grass as much as possible. So we actually kept these sheep on for only 10 days in this plot and then moved them on. And still, if you go out there now, almost a year later, you can still see the signature of where the sheep were grazing, and it cleared the area out pretty well. We're planning on keeping that going for a few years. And we have control plots and grazed plots that we're trying to compare and see what the lizards are choosing, as well as we're monitoring the plant communities out there to see if we are actually encouraging the native plant community to be restored through this grazing practice. The other thing we're doing is we're really cranking up our monitoring efforts. So instead of using that hand telemetry that we've always used in the past, and we got to see with the pond turtles earlier today, we are converting to the modern era, and we are using these digital tags that are quite a bit smaller, and they talk to remote nodes that we put out on the environment. At each of these little dots, those nodes then talk to a central tower, which is part of the MODIS network, if you've heard of MODIS. And what it basically allows us to do is every few minutes locate where an animal is at pretty high precision, within tens of meters. And we can do it again, like I said, every few minutes. And it's really revolutionizing our understanding of what the animals are doing on this landscape. So for example, instead of getting a few dozen locations for an animal over the course of the season, we got over 300,000 pings for animals in the 2024 season alone. And we can sort of piece together a much more complex and detailed story of how the animals are using the landscape. So in this plot, the blue stars are where we've actually hand-tracked lizards to. And then all the other points are estimated from that node array. And this is just for a 13-day period, right after release. And so we can see a lot more details of the landscape use. We can basically see where the animal has moved, what habitat is dried out, what habitat it hasn't in much greater detail. And it also allows us to answer questions like, what's home range size? When are the animals active? In greater detail. So this plot is showing another lizard, and the yellow line was how we would estimate its home range just from our hand tracking. And the light blue is how we would estimate their home range and their habitat use based on the node data. So we're getting a totally different answer to how they're using the habitat, really, when we're using the node data. It's also telling us more about when they're active. Remember, I told you at the beginning that there is this extended period that they're dormant. The adults from like late July, and they don't come up till April. And that is, it's not untrue. It's mostly true. The thing is, they're much jumpier that time of year. And so if you go out there as a big mammal looking for them, they dive into a hole and you don't see them. When you're not there and you just let them do their thing, it turns out they are coming up whenever the weather is nice. So this is showing the date on the x-axis. The y-axis is detected activity from that node array. And the red triangles indicate when we actually saw them. We went out there, we saw they were there. So a physical confirmation. And we can see that, yeah, they're active when we think they're active, but then during the whole period we think they're inactive, they're coming up opportunistically. And at least on a couple of those occasions, we went out and we saw them there. So we know it's really happening, which is giving us a really different understanding of their natural history on the environment, of how they're existing on the environment. All right, so I'm already out of time. I'm just going to give you a sort of quick summary. I said we released 35 last year, so how are they doing? 29 of them are still alive, as far as we know. They made it through the season. We will check on them in the spring. We're also seeing those pings come up when the weather's really nice. At least some of them are still coming up opportunistically. We have seen courtship of our releasees, although we have yet to document reproduction for many of our releasees. But still, early days. And we're going to keep this going until we get to a point where we have at least 50 females naturally born out there successfully reproduce. And we're going to see that as okay, we think they're at a point where they can build up to carrying capacity by themselves. We'll take the lessons learned and start applying them to other sites, places that organizations like Save Mount Diablo have purchased for restoration and need to have their wild birds back out there. But I'd like to thank you all. I had many generations of people sort of in classrooms helping with this work over the years. We've had multiple funders, notably here. Save Mount Diablo, through one of the Mary Bowerman grants, allowed us to purchase a scientific weather station out there that we've only had running for a year, but it's already transforming how we're maintaining our lizards in human care, especially over winter, because we know exactly what temperatures they would experience in their burrows over winter now instead of having to just guess. So thank you so much. If I have time, I'm happy to take questions.
Do your hybrid tags work when they're still underground?
Yes, they work for 3 days on battery power. And then they go quiet until the animal comes out again. And once it's in the sun for 10 to 30 seconds, they start pinging again. Yeah.